I know the consequences. I know where this is headed. And it is not a pretty picture.
America can't be great if it's broke. And we're broke.
There's a simple solution to the federal debt. You pay for it.
I'll tell you right now, there's no easy answers to these solutions. It's going to take sacrifice.
We have had the greatest economic downturn since the Great Depression.
Biggest lesson from the last recession is don't have a financial crisis.
By far the biggest cause is health care.
Baby boomers are retiring as the largest senior generation America ever produced. We're going to be living longer after 65 than any of our predecessors, and we're already bigger.
Each side wants to take one portion, but say it has to carry 100% of the solution. That'll never work.
We are deep, deep, deep in the hole, headed down deeper, and it threatens the America we've known.
This program is made possible by the Travelers Institute, an organization dedicated to furthering the public policy discussion about the facts of the U.S. deficit and its implications for the American opportunity.
Some people understandably say, boy, this is sort of dry subject, dollars, cents, debt. What's it mean to me? If I read the mathematics right, it means everything.
When you focus on reality, it's a pretty harsh lesson for America. Al and I came to the opinion that we face the most predictable economic crisis in history, that this fiscal path we're on is simply not sustainable. And if you were to try to think of an analogy, these deficits of over $1 trillion a year they're like a cancer, and they truly will destroy the country from within.
Why should people care? Because if the debt keeps going up, more and more of their federal tax dollars will be used to pay interest on the debt rather than to invest in our future through education and technology. Secondly, money will be more expensive for people, so their interest rates on their homes, their small business loans, cars, sending kids to college, all that will go up. So our economic growth rate will go down long term.
Three things have happened. Number one, well over $3 trillion of tax cuts not paid for. We have had 2 wars not paid for, and the economic downturn, which led us to the lowest revenue in 60 years as a share of our economy, and the highest expenditures in 60 years as a share of our national income.
Politicians know that their constituents are suffering. What does the politician do? Let's get people into housing. Housing gives them a stake in the future. It's an asset. You can borrow against it, and you can spend. But because it's consumption which is based on an underlying asset which has grown in value, you don't necessarily feel that you're consuming your way into debt. You're consuming against home equity. Over the 1990s and the early 2000s, the increase in house prices was very beneficial to the average American in the sense that it allowed greater consumption. All this is fine so long as it lasts.
The explosion of federal debt in the last 3 or 4 years has basically only one explanation: the financial crash and the deep recession that followed.
The investment bankers focus their attention on the biggest single asset that most middle-class people have, which is their homes.
Wall Street created financial instruments that had risks that were truly stunning.
They were borrowing on nothing for nothing on top of nothing.
Traders started betting on the fate of those new financial instruments. And then it all crashed.
You know, it appears there are always people who are so self-centered, they really don't give a flip what happens to all the rest of us.
There is lots of blame to go around. The mortgage originators who were shoveling out mortgages to people who were probably not going to be able to pay them. The bankers who were buying those mortgages and selling them around the world, and the regulators who should have been paying attention to this.
Look, they brought us to the brink. I was in the room when the former Secretary of the Treasury in the Bush administration and the Chairman of the Federal Reserve came to the leaders of Congress and told us they were taking over AIG the next morning, and if they did not, there'd be a financial collapse within days.
They walked into this room at 9 o'clock at night, and they said, that within 72 hours, the entire banking system of the United States and therefore the world will shut down. We were on the verge of the most cataclysmic fiscal event in our history. And what Secretary Paulson said was, I need the authority to make it clear that as Treasury Secretary, I can step up and protect these banks from failing so that they can do business with each other. Major companies in this country that are very well known, that are totally solvent, that are very strong financially, could not move money around. I mean, they literally could not open their stores the next day because they could not move money. Everybody just sort of sat there thinking, I'm sure the way I was thinking, you know, this is incredible.
This was an especially deep hole because the problem was in housing finance. Everybody has a house, and the housing crash has affected our whole economy deeply, and we're not out of it yet.
I've been doing this for 40 years. I think I've seen 300 debt commissions during that time, usually completely ignored.
A bipartisan group can sit down together and come up with solutions that nobody likes, because everything you do to reduce a deficit is unpleasant. I mean, you've either got to cut one kind of spending or another kind of spending or raise taxes. Those are the only options you have, and nobody wants to do any of those things.
Al says we've been very successful. We've achieved the pinnacle of our life. We pissed off everybody in America.
It took us 4 months to establish trust in our commission when we started. And the theme coming out of the Democrats was, who's the biggest spending president in the history of the United States before this man? Answer, George W. Bush. Never vetoed a single spending bill in 6.5 years till it came to stem cell research. So after that simmered down, the other side said, but this guy, Obama, is 4 times worse than Bush with the stimulus and TARP and this and that. Finally, Ursula and I said, well, keep scrapping and we'll just do a 2-member report, just the 2 of us.
I was on the commission. I voted for it, even though it was the president's commission, and 5 of his 6 people voted for it. The president walked away from it. If they were to just legislate the Simpson-Bowles language, then I think the recovery we would see would be extraordinary.
About 1/4 of what we did was revenue, and 3/4 was in the form of spending cuts. And the sum total of it yielded $4 trillion in deficit reduction. It's the minimum amount we need to reduce the deficit in order to stabilize the debt and get it on a downward path as a percent of GDP.
There's been a lot of criticism of the Obama administration for not more fully embracing the Bowles-Simpson Commission. The first thing you have to realize is the report had a significant amount of revenue contained in it, and therefore had almost no chance of passing the House of Representatives, regardless of whether the administration embraced it or not. So it's just an optics discussion of what plays better in terms of how you're presenting yourself if you embrace it or not. And that's a different discussion than it was actually going to happen if the White House embraced it.
I think they were sort of shocked. You know, I mean, I think they sort of appointed this commission, hoped that the issue would go away, and they just didn't want to risk the political capital of supporting their own commission's report.
We Americans have a healthy skepticism of bigness. We're skeptical of big business, big labor, and big government, and with good reason. And one reason that we're very, very careful not to allow monopolies whenever we can avoid them is they overcharge and mistreat their customers. They have no competition to force them to do otherwise. Government's the last big monopoly.
We don't trust government, but we need government. And government is us when you come right down to it. Those folks in Washington weren't, landed there from Mars. They were elected by us.
I can tell you there's enormous denial still in this town by the right and the left, who seem to think nothing happened in the last 5 years. Hey, something huge happened. We narrowly averted a depression. As a result, our deficit and debt exploded. We are in real danger of a financial debacle. And we can either face up to it and take it on now and have gradual change, or we can wait for the roof to cave in. And if we do that, shame on everyone involved.
I don't have that high a view of people whose first ambition is to stay in office. They're so afraid to tell the truth about the problem we have. They're so afraid even to venture a suggestion.
What's most difficult is dealing with people who just don't want to do anything. I mean, really are absolutely in denial of what is hanging over this country and seem to think that you can solve this without asking anybody to sacrifice. It's impossible.
We're the richest nation in the world. We can do anything we want to do. We can do any 100 things we want to do. The only thing we can't do is everything. And so now it's a matter of alternatives and choices and how we're going to spend the resources we have.
No Silver Bullet was the title of a Pew report. It actually is one of my favorite titles because it is an apt description of the tough choices that policymakers are facing when it comes to fixing the federal debt problem. There really is no silver bullet out there that is going to allow this country to fix its long-term debt problem.
We're probably the most famous name in advertising, but my job's to maintain and grow that mystique. Politics at the moment is disappointing. Wherever you go, it's sort of bereft of imagination. Politicians think we're moronic. We understand the debt problem. These turkeys don't, okay? Simplicity is everything, okay? But they don't understand it enough. They make it complicated. It's very simple, man. We are spending too much.
Congress has effectively become two different camps with almost no one in the middle. One of the strongest findings from social psychology is if you put like-minded people together in a group, the group becomes more extreme than any given individual within it. Fundamentally changes the nature of our political economy because it used to be that you'd get legislation done by getting the moderates to agree. But if there are no moderates, it's much harder to produce legislation.
A lot of the Democrats are mad because they say, well, This is mostly caused by the Republicans who cut taxes and increase spending. And for the last 30 years, that's true. Although the Democrats are not blameless, they supported some of these policies. The problem for the Democrats is that if you look at the next 10 years, most of it will be caused by things we care about. More people in retirement years spending more on health care.
You can make decisions that are unpopular early in your administration. So there's 2-3 years to go before your election. One of the reasons that we don't see much courage in the House of Representatives is because they're elected every 2 years.
American voters think short term, especially when they're hurting. People want quick answers, but the fact is that there aren't quick answers and that it's going to have to be a sustained effort over a long period of time. Right now, you're seeing a lot of political energy being put into attacking the short-term debt, but the broader debate, the larger and more important debate, is what we're going to do long-term. Getting rid of the turtle crossings is really not going to do all that much to help alleviate our long-term debt problem. The question is whether politicians who seize on those small symbolic measures as a way to appease voters who are concerned about spending, how are they going to tackle those problems which are not politically popular? They're actually calling for sacrifice.
When people out in America that I've talked to take a look at Wall Street, they say, well, first you took our jobs, then you took our homes, and then they look at Washington and they're saying, oh, and now you want to limit our Social Security pensions? We don't want any part of that, which is why 80% of the American people are opposed to entitlement reform.
Americans, in their defense, have been misled. I mean, a lot of people think that Social Security money, I paid that in. No, you didn't. You were paying for the retirees of 10, 20, 30 years ago. Today's young people are going to pay for you.
When Social Security came in, the average life expectancy in the United States was 64. And you got Social Security at 65. Which means, you know, in a funny sense, most people didn't live to see Social Security.
The baby boomers are retiring as the largest senior generation America ever produced. We're going to be living longer after 65 than any of our predecessors, and we're already bigger.
The baby boom generation has taken us from 35 million retired people to 70 million retired people. We have a system that is built on the basis of having more people to pay into it than take out of it. We've gone from, in the 1950s, 16 people paying into Social Security for every one person taking out, to today where we got 2 people paying into Social Security for every one person taking out. It doesn't work.
Which means you need the elderly, in the interests of the young, to accept a change.
Why should the baby boomers be putting such a burden on younger voters? People like me, frankly, will look at this and say, you know, we've got to come up with some better ways to deal with these problems, or else by the time that we retire, it's going to be a very bleak picture.
In 2037, Social Security will be insolvent, will be unable to meet its full obligations. At that point, the law requires that there will be an across-the-board cut. Right now, that is estimated to be 22%.
People also talk about changing the retirement age, and I would be careful about that, because when you actually talk to human beings, for some, the retirement age of 67 right now is way too old.
Where the job is difficult, it's something they don't actually enjoy, they want to get out of. Should those lives be extended as much as, say, the professor who sits in his chair and loves to think and finds that his work is, a form of enjoyment? think about the amount of lobbying that will be done as each profession wants to classify itself as a hardship profession with early retirement.
We don't have to do anything that affects today's beneficiaries or those who are coming within a few years. They should all be reassured, a deal is a deal, you're good to go. The changes we need to make there can start taking effect years in the future, but we better decide now.
Everything we have suggested, or any group in America has suggested to do something with Social Security, doesn't affect anybody over 60, and I get the most vicious letters from people over 60 and 70 and 80. Foul, I mean foul stuff. I'm good at that, but boy, I tell you.
If you mention Social Security, you are immediately attacked from the left and the right for some reason or other in very hyperbolized language, which makes discussion very hard and makes progress very hard.
We could index the benefits to the length of life so that the benefits went down slightly as longevity increased.
Why are we going to send a pension check to Donald Trump? The money ought to be for those people who, without it, are at risk of destitution in their older years.
Social Security today has a cap on it of about $100,000. If we remove that cap and said that every dollar you earn is subject to Social Security tax, it's estimated the Social Security Administration would add about 13% to its revenue.
You could make just a few changes in Social Security and make it good for 75 years. If you look at the dollars, it's quite a soluble problem.
We as a culture do not pass on to the next generation less of a nation. That if we continue on our present fiscal path, we're going to pass on to our kids a less prosperous nation where they'll have a lower standard of living, a massive debt that they can't afford to pay off, and therefore a less secure nation.
When it comes to debt and the pressures on government, there's a very simple way of looking at it. You can either increase revenue or decrease expenditures, and that's very clear.
There's no one solution. You have to do a little bit of everything. The reason that federal tax collections are low in relation to the size of the economy right now, we have cut tax rates, and we are an economy which has not fully recovered from the recession. People aren't earning as much, and tax rates are lower than they would otherwise have been if we hadn't cut taxes.
Ever since Ronald Reagan, the Republican Party in particular, but also some Democrats, have been afflicted by a particularly strange and virulent form of anti-tax fetishism.
The Bush tax cuts, which cost us well over $3 trillion, just in the first 10 years, will cost us much more than that over time, are part of the problem because they were never paid for with spending reductions.
If you look at public polling, most people say that one of the most effective ways to address the national debt is to get rid of the Bush tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans.
You know, taxing the very rich, there is some scope for increasing those taxes, but it's not going to be nearly enough to account for the higher liabilities that we have.
The good thing about the revenue side is we have a very inefficient tax code, and it's just full of loopholes and special provisions and things that benefit one group or another. If we eliminate some of those things or reduce them, then we could raise more money with a simpler tax code and actually lower rates.
Every state, in theory, has to run on a balanced budget because they don't get to print money like the federal government. That's the good news. The bad news is that means something very different from state to state.
There's been a devil's bargain that was made between state politicians and their public employees unions. If you give the public employees a significant wage increase, it means you probably have to raise taxes. If you give them a pension increase, it means you can kick it down the road. Well, we've been kicking this down the road for 20 years, and all of a sudden you got a lot of old, retired public employees who have to be taken care of.
Governments all over the place have done this. Indiana used to do it. The bills they delayed paying were to schools, universities, and local governments, who then had to go out and borrow money for 6 months or more.
States kind of face a little bit of a double whammy, if you will. The revenue drops because taxes are down, unemployment is up, and the population which becomes stressed and unemployed, and in many cases has less revenue, will be drawing down on state services like Medicaid, like unemployment. Or, this is another thing Illinois has done, they just don't pay their bills.
Well, you know, Illinois state government ranks right up there with Alabama and Louisiana as being the worst in the country. We're billions of dollars in debt, and we go further in debt every day, and this debt has to be paid. We have vendors for the state here who are 6 months behind in being paid for what the service or the goods they have provided. How can they stay in business? They can't.
Most time when people say, oh, you live in Illinois, they think Chicago. We're rural, we're south. Southern Illinois is poor. I enjoyed working the pharmacy. There was, to me, no greater joy than going down there and taking care of the patients.
Tom Miller and his wife were just like family to me. If any time I had any problems with my medication and I kind of got scared about something, I would call them because I felt like they knew as much about the medicine as my doctor did.
65% of my business was state welfare, Medicaid.
Our Medicaid customers would come in and we would fill their prescription, and they would sometimes pay a small copay, and then we would send the claim off to the Medicaid office and basically wait for our money to come.
We have to pay our wholesaler every 2 weeks for the medicine that we just dispensed. I wasn't getting paid from the state of Illinois for at least 5 to 6 months. My last check was for services provided 270 days ago. 9 months. Are there any politicians that's went 9 months without a paycheck? We did.
It was very hard for me to watch Tom go through this every day, the suffering and the grief, knowing that we were going to have to leave and we were going to lose the pharmacy.
On August the 19th, I came in at 8 o'clock that morning. And by noon it was over. And all we were left with was empty shelves and the keys in our hands.
When I drive by there, I just look at it and think, I wish they were still here.
Maybe there was something else I could have done. Guilt. Guilt that was undeserved. No, I've never been back. It hurts too bad. Years of my life. It's gone. That's it, guys.
To be honest with you, I deal in millions and billions so much, I don't even know if I could explain a trillion. And I write for a business publication. That's sad, right?
When you get up to $14 trillion, I don't even know how much that is. In space, we've got stars that are 1 billion light years away. Well, that's about the same thing as a $14 trillion debt.
The Big Bang Theory of the universe happened 13,600,000,000 years ago, and that's 1/3 of a trillion, and we owe 16 of those babies. Now there's really nothing funny about that.
Revolution starts with language. So we got to change the language. We got to reframe the problem. Donald Kahn, a great neurologist, has said, look, 80% emotional, 20% rational. Rational thinking leads to one thing, conclusions. And conclusions are not going to solve the debt problem. Emotion, on the other hand, leads to another thing, action. Okay? And we need to take action about the debt in the US. We need to change.
Everyone likes the idea of sacrifice in the abstract, but when they're actually asked to make sacrifice themselves, they balk. Politicians are going to have to overcome that resistance from the public if they're going to really tackle it.
The number one problem in solving the debt threat to the United States is public opinion. When you ask the American people, they say yes, get the deficit and debt under control. When you ask them the specifics, they reject nearly every one that would be necessary to actually resolve the problem. So, for example, they say don't touch Medicare and Social Security and the other healthcare accounts. That's 60% of federal spending. They say, and by the way, don't touch defense. That's another 20% of federal spending. So now you're left with 20% of federal spending to work with. When you ask them the specifics, you want to cut education? No. You want to cut veterans? Absolutely not. Do you want to cut parks? No. You want to cut research on energy to reduce our dependence on foreign energy? No. The one thing by a majority that they say they support reducing is foreign aid. Foreign aid is 1% of the budget. We're borrowing 40 cents of every dollar, and they say the one thing they're willing to do is cut 1 cent of every dollar. Hey, that's a big disconnect.
Democracy is just not a spectator sport. You can't vote for somebody and then sit back and expect them to win. We all have to get involved when it comes to moving our communities forward. We are interdependent on each other. In fact, people talk about a Declaration of Independence. I think America screams much more nobly towards a Declaration of Interdependence. We need each other in this nation to succeed.
About a year ago, I was in Singapore on the same platform as Al Gore. He's out there talking about, global warming and fear and all that kind of stuff. And then I come up, and I can just see the audience are like glazing over because they just don't. Yeah, sustainability, it's a good thing. They know that. But they don't know what to do. There's nobody. So I started to ask them, why are you all sitting there sort of like that, and what's going on? And there's people going, well, we don't know what to do. We know it's a good thing, but you know what? Not for me. What can we do? We're just one. We're just one. And we came up with this program called DOT. Do one thing. We did a great spot in Brazil. And the spot is called Pee in the Shower. Because if they pee in the shower, that'll save 4 liters of water from toilet flushes. And 4 liters of water a day, over 300 years, is enough to save a bunch of trees in the Atlantic rainforest. So pee in the shower, save the rainforests. That's what we got to do in the debt problem.
There are complicated things that politicians have to be able to explain to the public that are counterintuitive. The most important one is Keynesian economics, that when the bottom falls out in a recession, government has to work to get things moving again.
In this economy, if you tried to raise taxes or cut spending a lot on things that are keeping us going, government revenues would go down even more than spending is cut, and it wouldn't help.
That's counterintuitive. You mean I got to spend more money and build a bigger deficit even though our deficit's gotten pretty huge because people aren't paying as many taxes because they've lost their jobs? That's confusing.
That's what's so hard for ordinary people to understand. How can you be for stimulating the economy for the next 2 years and then putting the hammer down and cutting the debt for the 10 years after that?
The right policy combination today is to combine more support for the economy over the next couple of years with a lot more deficit reduction that is enacted now but takes effect in 2018, 2019, 2020.
We have an economy that the more you put pressure on capital, the less jobs. And for a city that has some poverty and is trying to create more jobs, we want to try to create environments where there's more job creation and more investment.
Because the unemployment benefits in the United States are typically much less than in other countries, the government has been much more eager to spend in an attempt to stimulate the economy, to get it growing again. And this kind of stimulus costs money. The real problem is it doesn't seem to have had much effect on job creation. Used to be that when the US economy went into a recession, it came out pretty quickly. And in fact, the deeper the recession, the faster it came out. What's been happening more recently is recoveries have been taking much longer. This one looks like it's going to be 5 years or more before the jobs come back.
Well, we're going to have to be honest about jobs in this country, which politicians have not been. Those good factory jobs that used to support an entire family are never coming back.
Many people think that the primary reason we've had job losses in this country is because jobs are being sent abroad. But really, the biggest source of job loss is technology. Let me give you an example of this. Think of the job of a secretary. This used to be a very important job. It used to occupy a lot of people, primarily women, and every executive beyond a certain level had a secretary.
Office of Mr. D'Amico, this is Jennifer. How may I help you?
A lot of those jobs are now being done by email. All the things that the assistant used to do has, in a sense, been made easier by technology. And as a result, that job no longer exists.
What do we do with all of those people who used to work in factories, but the jobs aren't there anymore? We need them to be working because we're not going to have a solid democracy if we don't have a solid middle class.
Over the past 2 to 3 decades, the effective global labor supply has doubled to quadrupled. The impact may be going up the income distribution. So whereas before it was affecting people right in the middle of the income distribution at the 50th percentile, say, it's creeping up to the 75th to the 90th percentile. Basically, at this point, anything that can be digitized is subject to that globalization force. And there are lots of things that even college graduates do that can be digitized.
If you bring the deficit down and move to a balanced budget, you drive interest rates down, which drives investment up, which creates jobs. We need to get it down because otherwise it will slow economic growth and paralyze our ability to invest in the future.
We live in a VUCA world. It's volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So you can spend time on budgets and strategies, and good luck, and a tsunami hits Japan. You can either take that on the chin and sort of get defensive, or you can think, yeah, it's a VUCA world, but it's a vibrant world, an unreal world, a crazy world, an amazing world, where creativity can make a difference.
We're spending approximately, as a country, $850 billion a year on healthcare that we would not spend if we had any other country's health system.
Healthcare is at the core of our long-term fiscal challenge. Between now and, say, 2050, almost all of the projected growth in the federal budget is expected to come.
By far the biggest cause is healthcare. We spend twice as much on healthcare in this country as any other developed nation, whether you talk about it as a percent of GDP or on a per capita basis. And our outcomes, we rank somewhere between 25th and 50th in things like infant mortality and life expectancy and preventable death. So we're not getting much bang for our buck.
We're still the best in the world at some things. We weren't good in heart surgery. Somebody else would be giving you this interview, right? But in terms of basic health care, a lot of these other countries are doing a better job than we are, spending less money. But the vast majority of the difference between us and everybody else are the sheer paperwork costs for insurance companies, healthcare providers, employers, and employees. Since 1970, per capita Medicare costs per year have gone up 400%. It's a lot, right? Since 1970, per capita private insurance costs have gone up 700%. If you cut Medicare spending and put people back in the private market, you're either going to put them in a more expensive health insurance market, which will lower their incomes, or you'll make them sicker because they won't have insurance.
If you take Medicare beneficiaries and you rank them by their costs, the top 5% of beneficiaries account for 40% of the total.
Medicaid is even more complicated. Populations that it serves are pregnant women, children, disabled adults, and the frail, disadvantaged elderly. The rule of thumb for Medicaid is that about 5% of the population drives about 50% of the costs.
The money is in typically chronic conditions, and often the care that's being delivered in those cases is what the provider is recommending. You're not going to make a lot of progress on changing the trajectory of healthcare costs unless you're affecting what providers are suggesting in those kinds of cases. Currently, the financial incentives in healthcare are for more care rather than better care, and that's exactly what we get. We get more care rather than better care.
We need far more competition, far more transparency, but we also need to make judgments about when treatments are necessary. There's this amazing statistic about the amount of spending that takes place in the last year of a person's life.
We as a society are far too litigious. We have to change the way we deal with tort law or suing doctors and suing hospitals so that we can afford to have doctors in hospital actually practice medicine instead of trying to defend themselves by practicing defensive medicine.
The Mayo Clinic lets you enroll in a healthcare plan where you have coordinated care, and then they do what's necessary to help you. So there's no incentive to run extra procedures. Most Americans pay for a procedure, so it's cheaper than 70% of the comparable health insurance in America, even though everybody knows it's great quality.
I have no doubt that down the line, we'll have better technologies enabling people to make more efficient choices on their treatment. Technologies which tell us which hospitals are really good, which treatments are more effective, and in a sense, how to pay for those treatments in a way that is cost effective.
But it's going to be much tougher, and it's going to require bipartisan cooperation because it's not easy to score. That's why this is so tough. But it's also why we need to be careful with it. We need to be dead serious. We need to level with the American people. Within 5 years, our health expenditures had to be X, whatever X is. But let's try to do it in a way that doesn't hurt people and lower their incomes, or doesn't lower the quality of care.
In 2020, simply letting the demographics run out with no change in the programs themselves, Social Security, Medicaid, and Medicare will exceed $2.5 trillion. So 8 years from now, those programs alone, forget defense spending, forget discretionary spending, forget other mandatory spending, those programs alone outstrip the total federal receipts that we collect this year.
In the United States, we don't have enough resources or savings to purchase all the debt that we're going to issue. In other words, we're borrowing so much to operate our government that the American people don't save enough to pay for that.
We're going to have to find ways to get investment in this country besides people just covering our deficit.
China's experienced a fair amount of economic growth over the last number of years, so it's got money to invest, and it has a high savings rate. American securities are a very safe and reliable investment.
Think about the Chinese producing Apple iPads. They put it together, Apple buys it from their Chinese suppliers, and they have to send those people dollars. So they write a check for the Chinese supplier takes that dollar, takes it to their bank, the bank then takes it to the central bank, and the central bank says, I have a bunch of dollars, what do I do? It goes out and buys US bonds. And, both sides, in a sense, are better off. The U.S. gets more iPads. The Chinese have some investments which they hope will retain value into the future.
China owns about 25% of our debt held by foreigners. They own $1.2 trillion. Japan's got about $900 billion. And there are problems with that.
At some point, people are going to look at our country and say, well, you're sort of like Greece. We don't want to buy your debt any longer. Or if we're going to buy your debt, we're going to make you pay so much for it that we're basically going to bankrupt you as a country.
The United Kingdom is the only country with a lot of our treasury notes that we have what you might call a normal economic relationship with. That's why I favor these trade deals. If you look at, when we make trade deals with countries, we negotiate it hard, we try to make it mutually beneficial, and we don't have big trade deficits with countries we have specific trade agreements with. But if you have a relationship with China and Japan, let's say, and they're your bankers and you've got to depend on them to buy your debt, it's very difficult to enforce any principles of reciprocity.
Admiral Mullen, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said the national debt is the #1 national security threat. Why would he say that? He's a military man. He is saying it because he understands the dependence of the United States on foreign lenders. Half of our debt now is being financed abroad. That puts the United States in a more vulnerable position.
That's doubly bad for America. It's bad for a couple of reasons. First of all, that's $1 trillion we can't invest in this country, in education or in infrastructure or in research to create the next new thing. But it's also $1 trillion that is going to be invested in Asia to educate their kids, to build their infrastructure, to create the next new thing over there so the jobs of the future are there, not here. That's nuts.
At some point here, if we stay on this course, we will find out what the effect is when the world loses confidence in the American currency, and it will be cataclysmic.
We spend more than the next 14 largest countries combined on national defense. It's causing us to hollow out the country. And I'll tell you how crazy it is. You know, we have this treaty with Taiwan that will protect them if they're invaded by China. The only problem is we'll have to borrow some money from China to do it. You know, it's like crazy.
And this is the dirty little secret of defense spending. These programs have remained in operation because they provide an awful lot of jobs. If you want to kill a submarine, you're taking jobs from 48 states.
And we had testimony from the top defense analysts in the country who pointed out to us 51% of all federal employees are at the Department of Defense. That does not count the contractors. When we asked them, how many contractor employees do you have? They said, we can't tell you. And we asked, why can't you tell us? They said, we don't know. And I said, well, is there a range? Yes, we can tell you there are between 1 million and 9 million. That's a pretty big range.
I built 7 defense budgets. We didn't hide the numbers. Matter of fact, we drown ourselves in the numbers. This is the largest enterprise in the world. We've got 300,000 vehicles. We've got 300 installations. We run the largest school system in the world, largest daycare program in the world. 350,000 kids are in daycare every day. We run the 7th largest grocery chain in the world. I mean, it's a massive enterprise. And as a result of that, the budget is large and complex. There's been an expensive set of wars, and the security requirements post 9/11 have driven up defense budgets, but only in the context of exploding budgets in general.
No one should confuse the issue that our solution here is premised in reducing defense expenditures materially. You could cut them to zero, and I'm not suggesting remotely that we do, but you could cut them to zero, and our deficit would still be $900 billion.
Every organization does well the things that are truly central to the organization. When I was in government and we had the Kosovo Air War, within a week we had 600 combat aircraft flown 4,000 miles to new locations, all put on bases, all able to support. We had fuel for everything, we had ammunition, we had maps. We were able to do that in a week. So this organization is a remarkably effective organization for the things that really matter. But when it comes to being efficient, being a well-run business, that's not our high priority. It's going to have to become a higher priority. But our central purpose is to fight and win wars.
Everyone realizes that there's a long-term problem. The way to solve that problem, you've got to tackle the revenue side of the equation, you've got to tackle the spending side of the equation.
If you want a balanced budget again, you have to get it the way we got it last time. You got to get it by cutting spending, raising revenues among those who benefited most and can best afford to pay, and with economic growth.
Right now, we can't think about 2 or 3 years from now. We can't afford to do that for our kids. We're going to be okay 2 or 3 years from now. We're going to come out of this recession, maybe not to where we were before. But what we really have to think about is where we're going to be 20, 30 years from now for our kids.
There's that old Winston Churchill saying, right? America eventually does the right thing after trying everything else. It may take an election or an election and a half, but really the whole process of trying to put the issues before the people so that they themselves get a good sense of the choices they have to make. I think that process is starting.
I'm not giving up on democracy. I don't know what the alternative is. If you say a democratic government can't solve this problem, then you're saying we need a dictatorship? I don't think so.
For the US, nothing is impossible. We've just got to face the bloody hard truth. We've got to start with facing the truth and fixing that. Because once Americans get onto execution and fixing stuff, they're unstoppable. Absolutely unstoppable.
This program is made possible by the Travelers Institute, an organization dedicated to furthering the public policy discussion about the facts of the U.S. deficit and its implications for the American opportunity.
This program was produced by Suzy Films, which is solely responsible for its content.